Today I'm going to tell you a terrifying story that will keep you up all night. This is a story about how a Soviet submariner killed several thousand innocent children and was awarded the title Hero of the Soviet Union for it. Alexander Marinesko sank the German liner Wilhelm Gustloff with thousands of passengers on board, most of whom were refugees and children. In terms of the number of victims, the sinking of this ship ranks among the top maritime disasters in the world. It surpassed the tragedy of the famous Titanic several times over. Today, I will tell you about the attack of the century and about the fate of Marinesko himself before and after the sinking of the Gustloff, as well as the victims of this disaster. In addition, I will dispel many Soviet myths associated with this tragedy. And of course, I will try to answer the main question. Who was Alexander Marinesko? A hero or a war criminal? My name's Semyon and this is Mikosha TV. Let's start. Portrait of a hero. The hero of my story was born in Odessa. His father, a former sailor of the Romanian fleet, fled from service in his homeland after beating up an officer. It must be said that Alexander Marinesko completely took after his parent in temperament, because he never knew how to rein in his larger-than-life impulses. After finishing school, Alexander became a sailor. He spent several years sailing on merchant ships and then was drafted into the Navy. Marinesko became a submariner, and it must be said that our hero's career advanced rapidly. By November 1938, he was already the captain's assistant, and 6 months later, Alexander was given command of the M96 Malyutka-class submarine. At that time, he was 26 years old. The war got off to a bad start for Marinesko. His submarine was damaged by German artillery fire, as a result of which it was under repair until August 1942. Because of the long period of idleness, the sailors went wild. Drinking flourished on board, and anti-Soviet talk began. As for Marinesko himself, taking advantage of the situation, he organized card games for money among the officers of the division. The situation got so out of hand that the authorities had to take drastic measures. 8 officers of the submarine brigade were put on trial, and 4 of them were executed. Marinesko was lucky. He got off with just being expelled from the party. I have to say, Alexander liked to have a good time and drink heavily. Malicious tongues claimed that catching him sober between missions was a rare stroke of luck. Although he never drank himself into a stupor, and at sea he didn't drink at all. Even before the war, Marinesko got into a drunken brawl at a restaurant in Tallinn, having a dispute over something with some hot-tempered local guys. He was sometimes late to the submarine due to drinking sprees and other incidents. And there was also the fire on his friend's submarine, which was started by Marinesko. He threw an unextinguished cigarette butt into the corner of the cabin. Following his father's example, he didn't hit his superiors, but he could easily tell them to go screw themselves, regardless of their rank or title. The superiors tolerated all these antics because Alexander was a good sailor and was respected by his subordinates. In 1943, Marinesko received the S-13, the submarine that would make his name go down in history. Alexander served honorably, though without any particular achievements. For example, in 1944, the S-13 attacked the German transport Siegfried. When the torpedoes missed, the submarine opened fire on the enemy with its artillery guns and seriously damaged it. Even earlier, Marinesko took part in a sabotage operation, the goal of which, as they say, was to capture the German cipher machine Enigma. His submarine landed a reconnaissance group behind enemy lines, and although the operation was not successful, Marinesko's participation was noted, and he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner. At the beginning of 1945, the S-13 was transferred to Finland, which had recently withdrawn from the war, and here it began to prepare for a new mission, however, in a rather peculiar way. The crew members started a mass brawl with the Finns, but the captain stood out even more. He got involved with a young Swedish woman and stayed at her place for several days. The girl's ex-boyfriend didn't get into fistfights, but immediately reported his rival to the Soviet command. Smersh got involved. And Marinesko was accused not just of going AWOL, but of espionage. After all, he was fooling around with a foreign woman. But here the crew stood up for the captain, refusing to go to sea without Marinesko. In the end, command didn't just brush aside all this circus and sent the submarine on its mission. For the crew, and especially for the captain, this trip to sea felt like being sent to a penal company. that on this mission they needed to accomplish something truly heroic. Otherwise, when they returned home, they would face serious trouble. After several weeks of fruitless searching in the stormy winter Baltic, Marinesko steered his submarine toward the Danzig Bay. When the Soviet submariners saw the huge ocean liner sailing on a straight course with its running lights on, they probably just couldn't believe their eyes. But it was the Wilhelm Gustloff, one of the most famous ships of the Third Reich. Wilhelm Gustloff was laid down at the Blohm & Voss shipyard in Hamburg in 1936. It was a huge 9-deck ocean liner, a real beauty. One of the largest in the world at the time it was built. The ship was commissioned by the Strength Through Joy organization. It was basically a state-run travel agency of the Third Reich, which organized leisure activities for Germans in line with the ideological principles of National Socialism. The liner was named after the Swiss Nazi Wilhelm Gustloff, who was killed by a Jewish student in February 1936. They say that initially the ship was supposed to be named Adolf Hitler. However, the Wilhelm Gustloff was only used for sea cruises for a short time. After the war began, the liner was turned into a floating hospital. Then it was handed over to the submariners, who set up barracks for cadets on board. In 1943, after a raid by American bombers, the liner got a hole in the plating on the starboard side. But it was hastily patched up and repainted. That's how it remained in the port of Danzig almost until the end of the war. In early 1945, the Red Army entered East Prussia, and they entered, as they say, with a bang. There remains a widespread memory of the atrocities committed by Soviet liberator soldiers in the occupied territories. This caused a huge wave of refugees who rushed to the ports of the Baltic Sea hoping to get on some ship. Wilhelm Gustloff, which had been docked for 5 years, was also involved in the evacuation of refugees. At that time, there were about 60,000 refugees in the port of Danzig. It's impossible to say now how many passengers were on board the Gustloff during its last voyage. The liner was literally packed to the brim. People were sitting in the cabins, in all the passageways and corridors, even in the technical rooms. Its usual passenger capacity was 1,463 people plus 417 crew members. However, according to modern researchers, at the time of the disaster, there were more than 10,000 people on board the ship. This included hundreds of wounded from nearby hospitals. But most of Wilhelm Gustloff's passengers were refugees, women, the elderly, and children. There were also a few young submarine cadets on board, most of whom were actually refugees, young women aged 17 to 25. They were accommodated in an empty swimming pool. When the overcrowded ship set out to sea, it was surrounded by a whole flotilla of boats packed with refugees. They say it was a heartbreaking sight. Mothers lifted their children above their heads or simply handed them over to the sailors. Out of compassion, the crew let another 2,000 people on board. Those who managed to get on the liner felt immense relief, for they didn't know they were doomed. And finally, the weather that day was just terrible, minus 10 degrees Celsius. A strong, piercing wind was blowing, and it was snowing. In such conditions, a person who ended up overboard had almost no chance. The Wilhelm Gustloff disaster, like the Titanic disaster, involved many fatal coincidences that came together and led to the catastrophe. Well, for example, there was no unified command on the ship. Nominally, the ship was commanded by 72-year-old Friedrich Peterson, but besides him, there was also Corvette Captain Wilhelm, the commander of the very submarine training unit that was stationed on the Gustloff. There were also 2 more lower-ranking captains on board, and they regularly interfered with the command as well. These comrades constantly argued about which channel to navigate the ship through and what precautions to take regarding enemy submarines and aircraft. Right after setting out to sea, a dispute broke out on the captain's bridge. So how exactly should we proceed? Korvettenkaptein Zahn suggested using an anti-submarine zigzag, but Peterson insisted on a straight course, arguing that they were low on fuel and the ship had sustained damage from an air raid. The younger crew supported the old man and the ship went straight ahead, straight to its doom. Fearing for the condition of the engines, as well as the hastily patched hole, Peterson proceeded at slow speed. This was yet another fatal decision. If the liner had been going at normal speed, Marinesko would never have caught up with it. Before heading out to sea, Gustloff received a radio message about a convoy of minesweepers that was supposedly coming to meet him. That's why he turned on the running lights to avoid collisions. In reality, there were no minesweepers at all. Where this message came from is still unclear. The lights on Gustloff not only allowed Marinetskaya to spot the liner, but also to carry out a torpedo attack under perfect conditions. At around 9 p.m., the submarine Marinetskaya fired 3 torpedoes at Wilhelm Gustloff. The first hit the bow of the ship, the second exploded in the empty swimming pool, literally tearing apart the girls from the naval battalion who were there. And the last one hit the engine room, leaving the ship dead in the water. Captain Peterson immediately understood what had happened. That's why his first words were, "That's all." A terrible panic broke out on the ship. The passengers who hadn't died in the explosions or drowned in the lower deck cabins rushed to the lifeboats. But it turned out that part of the crew, who were supposed to lower the lifeboats and evacuate the passengers, were trapped on the lower decks and died there. The passengers couldn't lower the lifeboats because they didn't know how to do it. Besides, many of the davits were covered in ice, and the ship was already listing heavily. Through the combined efforts of the crew and passengers, some of the lifeboats were lowered into the water, and yet many people still ended up in the icy water. Due to the ship's heavy list, an anti-aircraft gun broke loose and crushed a lifeboat already filled with people. Many people died in the panic and crush, especially children and women. No one helped the helpless pregnant women or wounded soldiers. The lifeboats were stormed. Those who were physically stronger managed to get into them. Many passengers who had weapons shot themselves, preferring suicide to a painful death in the icy water and darkness. Many of those who managed to get into the lifeboats froze to death before the rescuers arrived. In the strong wind, the soaked people turned into icy statues. Eyewitnesses recall a guide dog that, with its last strength, was pulling its already dead blind owner toward the side of the lifeboat. The life jackets were too big for the children, so when they fell overboard, they turned upside down. Only their helplessly kicking legs could be seen above the water. Rescuers and survivors recalled the hundreds of stiff children's legs sticking out of the water. Wilhelm Gustloff sank about an hour after the torpedo attack. The drowning were rescued by the torpedo boat Levi and the nearby destroyer T-38. The heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper passing by did not stop, fearing another torpedo strike. When the rescue ships arrived at the scene of the disaster an hour later, there were only corpses floating in the water. In one of the abandoned lifeboats, the rescuers found an infant who had been forgotten in the panic. The baby was alive and simply sleeping. He was the last person rescued from the Gustloff. According to various sources, between 949 and 1,500 people were saved out of more than 10,000 who were on board. By the way, contrary to the common saying that the captain leaves the ship last, all 4 captains survived the disaster. However, the youngest of them shot himself after the war. Soviet myths about the Gustloff. The history of World War II is full of terrible tragedies. However, the Wilhelm Gustloff disaster stands out even among them. In the Soviet Union, this was well understood, so they did everything possible to turn the killing of thousands of innocent people into a heroic deed. Soviet propagandists created a lot of myths around the sinking of the liner, some of which are still being spread today. For example, in the USSR, it was claimed that either 5,000 or 7,000 hardened Nazis, including high-ranking officers and party bosses, met their deaths on board the Gustloff. However, Soviet mythmakers never mentioned a single name or position. Needless to say, this is complete fiction. A much more popular myth is that Marinesko destroyed almost half of the German submarine fleet's personnel on the Gustloff. Usually people talk about 80 to 100 trained crews for the newest submarine designs. Yes, there were indeed submariners on the liner, most of whom were not very young at all. But how many actual crews could really have been formed from them? On the Gustloff, there were mostly sailors from the training unit who were not authorized to stand watch independently. After all, the crew of any ship is supposed to include officers of all specialties, from navigator to cook. Some Soviet mythmakers went even further. They claimed that by destroying so many German submariners, Marinesko supposedly saved England from a naval blockade, for which grateful Britons erected a monument to him in Portsmouth. However, for some reason, a photograph of the monument itself was never shown, probably out of great modesty. They also like to say in the USSR that after the sinking of the Gustloff, a 3-day mourning period was declared, and Hitler considered Marinesko his personal enemy. It's not clear at all where they got this nonsense from. In reality, the Nazis tried not to publicize the sinking of the ship or the number of victims, so as not to further demoralize their own population. Hitler really did call the killer of Gustloff his personal enemy, but it wasn't about the ship, it was about that Swiss Nazi after whom the liner was later named. It is not true that the Nazis executed the captain of the Wilhelm Gustloff or those responsible for his safety. All of them survived the war safely. The attack on the Gustloff also cannot be called a masterpiece of naval warfare, as modern Russian authors like to write. Yes, the crew of the S-13 did everything precisely and competently, but nothing more than that. It doesn't qualify as the attack of the century. No matter what criteria we choose here. If we're talking about the size of the target, the American Archerfish sank the newest Japanese aircraft carrier Shinano with a displacement of 72,000 tons on November 29, 1944. If we prioritize the propaganda effect, then the U-47 is unmatched here, as it broke into Scapa Flow and destroyed the battleship Royal Oak. As for naval warfare skill, it's worth mentioning the U-9 under Widdingen, which completely changed submarine warfare by sending 3 large enemy ships, the cruisers Cressy, Aboukir and Hogue, to the bottom in just 1 hour. Now that's what I call the attack of the century. A feat or a war crime? After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the history of World War II underwent serious rethinking. The tragedy of Wilhelm Gustloff was no exception. Marinesko is now being called a murderer and a war criminal, and on top of that, an alcoholic who disregarded discipline and subordination. I've already spoken about the alcoholism, but war crimes are a much more serious accusation that requires clarification. I'll say right away that the sinking of the Wilhelm Gustloff cannot be considered a war crime. The submarine crew couldn't have known that the ship was mostly carrying children and refugees. The liner was armed, was accompanied by a warship, and did not have Red Cross markings. So from a legal point of view, Marinesko is in the clear. But from a human perspective, it's hard to call him a hero. You immediately remember the children's bodies in the icy waters of the Baltic. And his attack of the century is better called the murder of the century. After all, with 3 torpedoes, he drowned more civilians than all the submariners did in both world wars combined. But the real crime is Soviet-Russian propaganda, which is why people today understand nothing and consider themselves a heroic nation, saviors and liberators. Just as I don't understand people who justify Russia's bombings of Ukraine, I also don't understand those who call Marinesko a hero. By the way, Marinesko's life ended badly. Already in the fall of 1945, he was expelled from the army. In civilian life, things went completely downhill for him. Service in the Baltic Shipping Company, dismissal, prison sentence for theft, unsuccessful attempts to return to military service, then a serious illness. Marinesko died of cancer at the age of 50. Conclusion. Terrible things constantly happen in war. That's its vile nature. However, wars come to an end, and then they are re-evaluated. And few people think of glorifying the obvious atrocities. I haven't heard Americans call the pilots who dropped nuclear bombs on Japanese cities heroes. However, that didn't work in the Soviet Union. There they denied any of their own crimes during the war in every possible way. It seems that today's Russian propaganda is following the same path, bringing out old Soviet myths from the mothballs. As for Marinesko, if anyone still considers him a hero, just imagine before you go to sleep that you are on that ship because you want to save your children. Thousands of children are on the ship. Night is approaching. Many are already asleep and you seem to be safe. But then suddenly there are explosions. The ship is sinking. Screams, panic, blood. Minus 10 degrees Celsius. Can you call the person who did this a hero? To reinforce our discussion, watch a video about heroes of the special military operation when you have time. Goodbye, everyone.